It was called the War to End All Wars, but we know how that turned out. World War I, a massive, brutal conflict that started with a single spark, ended up pulling the entire world into a giant, deadly struggle. And right at the heart of this whirlwind was England. But how did England, a small island nation, end up with such a major role on the global stage? And what happened when this powerhouse got swept up in one of history's biggest battles? To understand England's role in World War I, we need to rewind to the early 1900s. The world looked very different back then. Europe was divided into alliances and empires, each watching the other like hawks. On one side, we had the Central Powers, with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. On the other side was the Triple Entente, a fancy name for an alliance between England, France, and Russia. This setup created a tense standoff, like two wrestlers circling each other, just waiting for one to make a move. Now it's important to understand why England was even interested in getting involved in European affairs. After all, England had the English Channel, an actual body of water, between itself and mainland Europe. They had a long tradition of staying out of other countries' messes. But, at the same time, England was one of the richest, most powerful nations on Earth. They had a massive empire that stretched across continents, controlling places like India, Canada, Australia, and parts of Africa. England had a lot to lose if the world went up in flames, so they weren't about to let Europe fall under the control of any single power. The spark that set off World War I happened in 1914, in a small town called Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist. Austria-Hungary was furious, and, backed by its ally Germany, declared war on Serbia. In response, Russia, Serbia's ally, declared war on Austria-Hungary. This led to Germany declaring war on Russia, and then on Russia's ally France. Soon, the conflict spiraled out of control, and suddenly, Europe was a battlefield. So where did England fit into all of this? Well, England was allied with France and Russia, but there was one more thing that finally forced them into the war: Belgium. Germany, in its plan to quickly knock out France, decided to invade Belgium. The problem? Belgium was a neutral country, and England had signed a treaty promising to protect Belgium's neutrality. When German troops marched into Belgium, England couldn't just sit back. On August 4th, 1914, England declared war on Germany. And just like that, England was in. In those early days, many Englishmen thought the war would be quick, maybe even fun. People imagined themselves marching to glory, fighting for king and country. Recruitment posters went up everywhere, urging young men to enlist. And enlist they did, by the thousands. For the soldiers heading to the front, it felt like a grand adventure, a chance to prove themselves and serve their country. Little did they know what horrors awaited them. Once England was in the war, they brought a crucial weapon with them: their navy. The Royal Navy was the pride of England, the largest and most powerful navy in the world. With it, England was able to impose a naval blockade on Germany, cutting off vital supplies of food and resources. This blockade would slowly strangle Germany's economy and weaken its army over time. But England's navy wasn't just about stopping supplies. It was also about protecting the flow of their own resources from the colonies. England's empire was vast, and they needed the materials and manpower from across the world to keep fighting. The Navy also had the job of transporting troops and equipment to the front lines. Millions of soldiers, food supplies, weapons, and ammunition had to be moved across the English Channel to support the war effort in France. The Channel, a narrow strip of water between England and France, became one of the busiest and most dangerous waterways in the world. German submarines, called U-boats, patrolled the waters, looking to sink Allied ships. Many English ships went down, taking soldiers and supplies with them. The fight against these submarines became one of the first large-scale battles in naval warfare, marking the rise of the submarine as a powerful tool in war. But despite their powerful navy, the war soon became something that no one had expected: a long, bloody slog of trench warfare. The Western Front, stretching across Belgium and France, turned into a nightmare of muddy trenches, barbed wire, and constant shelling. England's soldiers, along with their French allies, dug in, trying to hold back the German forces. Life in the trenches was miserable. Soldiers faced mud, cold, rats, and the constant fear of attack. The deadliest weapon in this trench warfare? Machine guns, which could mow down entire lines of advancing troops in seconds. Suddenly, war wasn't about heroics or glory. It was about survival. To make things even worse, a new kind of weapon appeared on the battlefield: poison gas. The first large-scale use of chemical weapons occurred during this war, and England's troops were among the first to experience its horrors. Soldiers had to wear gas masks, awkward and uncomfortable, to protect themselves. Chlorine and mustard gas were used to choke and blind, causing terrifying injuries and deaths. The gas attacks added a new layer of horror to an already brutal conflict. At home, life changed dramatically too. England had to mobilize its entire society to support the war. Factories that once made regular goods were now producing weapons, tanks, and uniforms. Women, who had previously been confined to domestic roles, were now working in factories, driving buses, and serving as nurses on the front lines. For the first time, England was truly seeing women step into roles traditionally held by men. The war reshaped society in ways that no one could have imagined, and women's contributions during this time planted the seeds for future rights movements. One of the most tragic events of the war for England came in 1916, with the Battle of the Somme. This battle was supposed to be England's big push, a chance to break through German lines and turn the tide of the war. The English forces, joined by the French, launched an offensive on July 1st, 1916. What followed was one of the bloodiest days in British military history. In a single day, England lost nearly 20,000 soldiers. The battle dragged on for months, with over 1 million casualties by the end. The horror of the Somme made it clear that this war wasn't going to be won easily or quickly. But even as the war dragged on, England was not alone. Their empire provided vital resources and troops from places as far as India, Australia, and Canada. Soldiers from across the British Empire fought side by side with English troops, adding to the sense that this was a truly global conflict. England's colonial soldiers played crucial roles in many battles, yet their contributions were often overlooked or underappreciated back home. As the years went by, the toll of the war became too much to bear. The people of England were exhausted. The government was stretched thin. Food shortages became common, and rationing was introduced. The population grew weary of the constant stream of bad news from the front lines. But England held on, knowing that giving up was not an option. Then, in 1917, a major development shifted the balance. The United States entered the war, bringing fresh troops, resources, and a morale boost to the Allied forces. England had been carrying the weight of the war for so long, and the American entry provided a much-needed surge of energy. With new allies, England and the rest of the Allied forces began to push back the Central Powers, slowly but surely. By November 1918, Germany was weakened by the relentless pressure of the Allied forces, the blockade, and internal issues. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed, and World War I finally came to an end. England, along with its allies, had won, but at a tremendous cost. Nearly 1 million English soldiers had lost their lives, and millions more were injured or traumatized. Entire towns had lost their young men, leaving empty spaces in communities that would never be filled. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new world, but also the end of an era for England. Though victorious, the country was left scarred, both physically and emotionally. The war had drained England's resources, weakened its economy, and shaken its belief in the old ways of life. The Grand Empire would never be quite the same. The legacy of World War I changed England forever. It showed the world the true horrors of modern warfare, and it left a generation questioning the cost of glory. England had played a huge role in the conflict, and though they had emerged on the winning side, the price they paid was heavy. It was a victory, yes, but one tinged with unimaginable loss. And as the soldiers returned home to a country they barely recognized, England and the world knew that things would never be the same again.